So before we dive into the details of garbage collection, let's just recap some of the basic ideas and some of the things that we have inside the Java virtual machine. The memory space in an application is broken down into two so-called generations, a young generation and an old generation. And all new allocations typically go into the young generation. These objects are allocated into something called the Eden space. You can imagine where the phrase comes from. This is the very early space that we're going to allocate objects into. Also, as part of the young generation, are two so-called survivor spaces. And these get used when memory in the young generation is garbage collected. So objects that survive a garbage collect in the young generation get moved into one of these survivor spaces. Only one survivor space is in use at any one time. Once a garbage collection happens, objects get copied into a new survivor space, and any objects in the original survivor space also get copied into the new survivor space. So all objects that have survived this young generation garbage collect live inside one of these survivor spaces. The old generation is where long-lived objects go. Now, we haven't defined what we mean by long-lived yet, but we will talk about that a little later. But essentially, once an object has survived a number of garbage collects, at that point, the runtime decides this object will now essentially live forever, and it'll move it into the old generation. So the memory layout is something like this. Again, this is meant to be diagrammatical. This is not an exact representation of the memory layout inside the application. So here we can see the young generation with the Eden space and the two survivor spaces labeled S0 and S1. We have the old generation, also called the tenured space, where old objects live, and these objects can live for a long time. There's also something called the permanent generation, or the permanent space. And in here are things used by the Java runtime. So things like, for example, class information is stored here. And essentially this space is never garbage collected. So why do we have these two generations? Well, the idea is that once objects have survived a few garbage collect, i.e. they become old objects, they are much less likely to die. They're more likely to survive for a long time. So we move these objects into this old generation space, and the garbage collector runs less frequently on this space. So objects in the young generation tend to live for a short time, whereas objects in the old generation have already lived for a long time and are likely to carry on living, so are less likely to need garbage collection. And the idea is that you tend to die young or live forever. It's called the young generation theory of garbage collection.